Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1932-1933 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Katharine Hepburn won for her performance in Morning Glory. But why did she beat fellow nominees May Robson and Diana Wynyard? We'll explore all this and more on today's episode of And the Runner-Up Is. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the sixth year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which comprised the years 1932 and 1933. And we'll be discussing why Katharine Hepburn won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. Fun twist with this one, we actually do know, so in this case, we will explore why. And my guest today, I'm so pleased to say, is actually my first new guest of this Best Actress series. He hasn't been heard at any point before on any of the previous iterations of the show. A writer for The Film Experience. Welcome to the show, Cláudio Alves.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been a fan of
yes.
the podcast for a long time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I know that you have written plenty about movies of all eras and the Oscars, so I'm very excited to have you on.
Thank you. I don't usually write about performances that were actually nominated, so...
Right, exactly. So this will be a fun little change of pace, I suppose. But before we talk about this year, I actually want to get your thoughts on Best Actress as a category, what your taste is. So, Cláudio, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
My favorite Best Actress win, and I actually have written sort of a ranking for a Portuguese publication once, so I've had to set this in stone. My favorite is Vivien Leigh for Gone with the Wind. The film is controversial, and I certainly agree with a lot of criticism of it, and even criticize it myself, but I really do love her performance. The modulation of it, the hyper-stylization of some moments, the glamour of it all, and the rawness she finds even within this realm of old Hollywood epic acting. I think it's very difficult to act within an epic, and she does it effortlessly. It's amazing.
Yeah, I actually happen to agree with you on that one. I think she's magnificent, and the fact that she's able to carry all 4 hours of the film is a testament to her abilities. So we're on the same page on that one. So my other question is, what is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress? One of those moments where you either look back on history and just wonder how someone didn't win, or even a more recent year where you were actually watching the Oscars and you were rooting for someone and they somehow didn't end up winning.
Well, usually everyone I root for ends up losing. That's usually the rule. I'm very seldom pleased with the results. But I would have to look back to before I started watching the Oscars, which was in 2006, to go to the most egregious loss. To me, it's Judy Garland in A Star is Born. It's one of my favorite performances of all time. It was a robbery. It was a robbery. I don't want to throw shade on Grace Kelly, but as good as she could be, I think Judy Garland's performance is just on another level altogether.
Yeah. You are not the first person to say Judy Garland was robbed for A Star is Born in life or even on this show. Nobody's, you haven't heard any other episodes, but it has been brought up now multiple times that she was robbed, and I agree. And that is a really stellar lineup. I don't necessarily begrudge Grace Kelly for winning that, because that's also a good performance, but damn, that was the time. That was the time. It would have been a great moment, but alas, can't wait to talk about that one. All right, well, let's talk about this year, the 6th Academy Awards. Once again, the Academy only decided to nominate 3 performances in the acting categories for reasons I haven't been able to ascertain. But the nominees were Katharine Hepburn for Morning Glory, May Robson for Lady for a Day, and Diana Wynyard for Cavalcade, with the Oscar winner being Katharine Hepburn in Morning Glory. Claudio, in looking at all these performances collectively, what are your sort of general thoughts on these performances and the types of roles that the Academy chose to nominate? Did you notice any patterns through these three?
Well, more than the types of roles, I was fascinated by the type of performer that they decided to honor this year. These are all actresses that started their careers on stage, and some of them more famously than others. And especially in Katharine Hepburn's case, the entire film revolves around a stage actress. So I found that a fascinating connection, especially because in something like Cavalcade, the connections to the stage, while not as metatextually obvious as in Morning Glory, are very apparent and I would say to the film's detriment.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But I will, yeah, this is a weird lineup for me. I'll just say up front. I mean, outside of the just iconic nature of having Katharine Hepburn here and winning her first of 4 Oscars, I can't say that I'm thrilled by this lineup on the whole. We talked about this last week where the Academy was, like you said, very interested in former stage actors or current stage actors, kind of like the grand dames of the stage, and, you know, not so much defaulting to the most popular movie stars of the day necessarily, like they did for the first few lineups. And once again, we do have a lineup where all 3 actresses, they hail from the stage, they have a kind of special pedigree, they aren't necessarily like the headline makers, but they do have respect, even if, you know, a Katharine Hepburn or Diana Wynyard are more newer to the scene than May Robson. There's just a bit of classiness to this kind of a lineup, and maybe you could say some snobbery here with wanting this type of actress to be nominated. You know, like they don't have the personal baggage. They're not even really like the insider kinds of picks like a Mary Pickford or Norma Shearer, who just have a leg up because of who they are in the industry. So yeah, it seems like they're looking to be a little more upper crust, a little more elite with their taste, and it's interesting to watch that evolve.
And in the cases of Wynyard and Hepburn, it's also interesting that these are some of their first films, while Robson did start making films during the silent era. The 2 younger actresses, even though they started on stage, they were film ingenues at this time.
Yep, exactly. So another thing about this, I mentioned it at the top, the Academy actually was transparent about the runners up in all of the categories, actually, which means for our purposes, we actually have confirmation about who the runner up of this lineup was. And in that spirit of transparency, I'll just reveal that up front. The Academy did announce that the runner up to Katharine Hepburn was May Robson. So we will explore how that happened, more so than like guessing who it was, later in the show. But let's just talk about her performance first. Let's talk about May Robson for Lady for a Day. May Robson, she was 75 when she received this nomination. She was another example of a woman like Marie Dressler who did find success in Hollywood at more of an older age. But yeah, she was a very accomplished theater actress. She first started acting in the 1880s, and eventually she had her own theater company that was touring. Also, I found out that at her first stage performance, her name was misspelled. Her real name was May Robson, but they left out the I, so she actually decided to make it May Robson for good luck, she said. So there you go.
It's better than Ada Lovelace.
Yes, that's fair. More on that later. But eventually she made it into Hollywood, where she played in a whole bunch of films in the 30s. She was all over the place, a lot of kind of mother roles. You were saying to me in the DMs during the lead up to this recording that she was in like, what, 10 or 11 films in this year alone?
So she had 13 films eligible that year.
Yeah. and one of them being Alice in Wonderland, playing the Queen of Hearts.
Nightmare fuel.
Haven't seen it. Scared to. But she was
Don't
also in Dinner at 8 alongside Marie Dressler, which which is important to note for the production of this film. So, Lady for a Day was directed by Frank Capra, and basically he wanted Marie Dressler for this part, which was not a surprise considering this kind of role is very much her bread and butter, but she wasn't able to be lent out because she had a contract elsewhere. So he did cast May Robson 1 week before they started filming. 1 week. Plus, the other actors were all kind of less established names, and he says that helped to basically lend some authenticity to the parts, which I suppose it does. But to get into a synopsis of the film, she is playing a woman named Apple Annie, who is a poor woman who sells apples on the street, hence why she's called Apple Annie. And she has a daughter. She had a daughter many years ago, but she sent her away to a convent when she was very young. Her daughter thinks that she is a very rich woman in New York because that's what she tells her. But then one day, the daughter and her fiance decide to come and visit Annie. So she and all her friends sort of scramble to make it seem like she's the rich woman that she claimed she was. And so everyone sort of puts on a front to help pull this off. So this is an interesting one because I mentioned this on the Best Picture series when I did that episode. This film, it starts off very much centering Annie and centering May Robson, but then by the time the second act hits, I think the film kind of starts to abandon her, where it becomes more about the men who are sort of pulling off this whole thing. Comes back around at the end, but there's just a big chunk where she kind of fades into the background a bit. So I'm curious your thoughts on whether this film and this performance still worked for you, even with that slight unevenness.
Well, like you, I'm generally underwhelmed by this lineup.
Yeah.
That being said, I think there is much to appreciate, admire, and even love about Robson's work. Maybe also because both the storyline and the camera give her so much more attention. On the first half, I was more interested in what she was doing when she was playing the down on her luck Apple Annie before her transformation into this grand dame of high society. It's a very demonstrative performance. I'm thinking, for example, when she is reading the letter that her daughter sent her, where she announces she's coming to America. She illustrates the big emotions very clearly, but there is an equilibrium. It never veers into a schmaltzy cartoon. And I really admire that about the entire performance, even though I have some significant issues with the second half of the movie.
Yeah. I do. I think, in spite of her lack of screen time in general, I do think she is really good here. And I think she definitely takes advantage of the time she does have. She sells that raggedness really well at the beginning, like you were saying. And she sort of has like the hunched over kind of body language and this very street smart way of talking that feels pretty authentic. I think she really plays into the desperation also of her role really well, just the sense that this is a woman who's just gone through the ringer of life, and there's this one thing that she holds on to, which is the well-being of her daughter. And when that's being threatened, she gets to this really desperate place, and all the sort of toughness she had before sort of goes away, and it's just her primal, and the scene that's really effective for me is when she first learns that her daughter's coming, and she goes to the hotel manager and she's just like pleading with him to somehow make it seem like she died, which is like such a low moment, where she would rather have her only child think that she's dead rather than have her see her as a lower class person. Very impactful.
I would agree. That scene really impressed me too. Maybe even more because of how harsh Robson allows her portrayal of Apple Annie to be.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very easy to make her into this beatific martyr that is very easy to love, but when she is exploring the depths of Annie's despair, there is an ugliness to Robson's work. She gets really angry with the hotel manager, for example, and she's not trying to make him or the audience feel sorry for her as much as she's playing someone that is at the end of her rope and just needs this one thing. It surprised me, especially because, Frank Capra's films are known for their syrupy nature, and I don't think this one deviates a lot from that idea, even though in the same year he directed other films that do contradict this notion a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the expectation of a syrupy nature to the role, and really the fact that you can imagine another actress running with it. I was very surprised and I admired Robson's contention. In the second half of the film, I wanted her to go a bit farther than she went.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say this as far as sort of the transition. I personally have already encountered a number of times among the Best Actress nominees of this era this kind of character with the self-sacrificing mother or the maternal figure who's separated from her child or loses a child. And just in doing my own experience of doing this show, it's a little derivative at this point in terms of plot, but I do think that she captures the fragility of that experience well, and like you said, is still giving it the complexity of not making her too much of a martyr. And then when she gets to transforming into this upper class woman, it's interesting because there's like a offhand mention of the fact that she used to be someone who presented herself that way, or she used to have that kind of status, more glamorous, like many, many years ago, decades. And I do feel that even if the transition between those 2 points feels a little bit sudden in terms of the film itself and how it's edited, it sort of makes sense that just when she's finally wearing these nicer clothes and she has her hair done and she's in this beautiful room, she sort of reverts back into the person that she used to be. And I don't think any of that is necessarily on the page by any means, but it's sort of what I took from her suddenly appearing so different and acting so different and wanting to be so different.
No, I also got that idea from her performance more than the text itself, so much so that I went back to read the short story that originated this film to see if there was some more information. I found out that Annie was supposed to be Spanish, which was interesting. But in the short story, there's also that reference that she used to live a glamorous life. She used to have servants. Mm-hmm. So in some regards, she was at least a version of this woman she's now pretending to be. Right. At the same time, I felt I needed to see more transitional elements.
Yeah.
Especially in her voice. Her voice work is so cartoonish, not in a bad way, but so very delineated as an expression of her street life at the beginning of the film, that to see it completely disappear in the second half, even when she is contemplating, revealing, when she's completely desperate, when she thinks it's all over. I wanted maybe to see some of the earlier Apple Annie resurface, which doesn't at all. It seemed like a missed opportunity for the actress.
I agree completely. And it's like you sort of almost want a scene where she might slip up at any point, sort of like a Pygmalion kind of thing, which is what this story is reminiscent of. I get frustrated when the film sort of deviates into being more about these guys who are trying to pull off this ruse rather than actually fully exploring her story.
There was one element that I really like that she used mostly at the beginning of the second half, which is how she holds onto her handkerchief, almost like a lifeline.
Yeah.
There is some restlessness to her hands, and she grips it very tightly throughout. And I thought it was such an interesting little detail that might show the acting within the performance. Because this is obviously it's a performance of a character, but the character is also playing, it's also acting. And I thought that was an element that delineated that Matryoshka doll of different levels of fakery going on. It's something tiny, but I appreciated it. I was frustrated because I wanted to see more of that, more modulation, especially as you said, as things go wrong at a certain point, you want Capra to pull something more from her. Because after seeing the beginning of the film, you know as an audience member that she's capable of more, but she's just not doing it. And the camera is also suddenly not very interested in her, as you say. It's more interested in the man, in the politicians and criminals, all this urban cosmos that makes the fairy tale possible.
To compare it to another performance in a film I've talked about on this show is I had a lot of these frustrations with The Divine Lady with Corinne Griffith, where it felt like, okay, here's this interesting story about a woman who goes from rags to riches, and this is going to be about her and her emotional journey, but then it gets distracted along the way by like the battle scenes, and this romance between her and this other guy becomes the focus, and then it decides to only focus on him in the end, and it feels weirdly disjointed. And I kind of did feel the same way here through the very long portion of the middle, where it's like, the screenwriter and Frank Capra just became more interested in these gangsters and preventing the journalists or the police from finding out. And it just really seems like we tossed her to the side. It's watching this again, I thought of I, Tonya, at the point where like Allison Janney is looking at the camera and she's like, well, my storyline's disappearing. Like it just it ends up feeling like she's only the catalyst to a story that the filmmaker might find more interesting, rather than really focusing on following this woman's journey. But then again, like, I read the short story that you sent to me that is the source material for this, and even in that case, she does feel like a kind of a sideline character. So it feels like it's part of the story and how it originated to begin with. So they didn't really deviate too much in that regard. If anything, they gave her more.
I was interested to see if Capra had improved that aspect later on, because he did remake this film as Pocketful of Miracles in the 1960s, and I was surprised to see, oh, he added more things with the mobsters. Okay.
There you go.
Though the girlfriend, the mobster's girlfriend, is much more explored in that film, and I enjoy that. She's probably my favorite character from the remake.
Too. Yeah, I mean, we do get more good stuff from her again towards the end, where she has some really, really effective scenes of really doubting whether she could really pull off this party function and that they're throwing for her. And the moment where she almost tells them the truth about the whole thing is very tender and very affecting, and she's saying so much without saying anything at all. But I also just feel like there was so much left unexplored that she was ultimately just let down by the writing, and that's not her fault, but she can only do so much.
I would go so far as to say that her best moment in that second half of the picture is a moment where she's working beyond the writing. It's those silent instants where she's almost readying herself to tell the truth, and the camera's in front of her, and you follow her, and there is this internal struggle that Robson projects very well through a matriarchal steeliness. That moment I thought was perfect. And again, I wish the film were more interested in exploring such instances of Annie's growth as a character, because despite at the beginning looking like she's going to be our protagonist, by the end she's just a reactive figure, more object than subject, really.
I mean, there's even I don't even remember if there's dialogue, but there's towards the middle to the end where there's a scene where she's outside with her daughter, and it's like nighttime, and even there she's not even really saying much, but she's just so full of emotion and love that her daughter is back in her life. And you really do, like you said, see her working more than what is actually on the page. So this is truly a prime example of one of these actresses who is going above and beyond what was even written for them. So kudos to you, May Robson. As of now, I did read that May Robson is the 5th oldest Best Actress nominee of all time. The only ones who have managed to surpass her at this point are, can you name them? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh no. Okay. Emmanuel Rivas to be one of them for Amour.
Yes, she's actually the oldest, so good job on that one.
The obvious one.
Yeah.
Okay. Judy Dench for Philomena.
Yes. Yep.
Okay,
And
now I guess
the other two are a little older, not age-wise, but in the course of time.
Geraldine Page for Trip to Bountiful.
No. Nope.
Should have prepared more.
It's okay. You didn't have to. This is a pop quiz. I can tell you the other two if you're stumped.
Well, I don't want to take too much time from you.
That's okay. That's okay. The other two were Jessica Tandy for Driving Miss Daisy.
Oh, of course.
Who won. And the other one was Edith Evans for The Whisperers. So there you go. Yeah. So, but May Robson, she held on to that record for a long time of being the oldest, all the way up to the late 60s. So this was a very unique kind of nomination for an actress of this stature. And again, she wasn't even like a leading lady so much. She did a lot of supporting roles, and this was one of her rare opportunities to really shine as, I mean, in theory, a leading lady, even though she doesn't get enough screen time, like we were saying. But I'm just glad that she got this nomination.
In a certain regard, it reminds me of Faye Bainter's 1938 Best Actress nomination, the rare opportunity of a character actress to, at least in theory, getting the spotlight.
Right. Or like a way later down the line, a Melissa Leo for Frozen River kind of thing. So that's always nice to see. But looking at some reviews of the time, this was from the New York Times. All it said for her performance was, they said, Miss Robson is splendid as the aged schemer, which is fine. But Variety said, on the performance end, May Robson dominates the first reel, but is thereafter rather subordinated as the story gets into the comedy side plots. And to that I say bingo. So even at that time, Variety was mentioning the fact that she sort of got the short end of the stick by the end of the film. So I think that's interesting. It's not just our contemporary view.
It's always nice to know that we're not so far off from what the original audiences might have perceived too.
Exactly. All right. Well, do you have any other thoughts on May Robson before we move on to our other losing nominee?
Well, I would like to stall as much as I can because I don't want to talk about that other film.
Oh, boy.
I will just say I wish Robson had been nominated in 1938 for Best Supporting Actress for Bringing Up Baby.
Yes.
Just that.
Bringing Up Baby was robbed of multiple acting nominations, hers included. So there you go.
I know it was a flop, both critically and commercially, but it's aged so well.
I think if she had been around even longer, she could have gotten a few more supporting actress nominations, would be my guess. So, well, it's time to stop delaying the inevitable. It's time to talk about Diana Wynyard for Cavalcade. Oh boy. All right. Yay. So well, Diana Wynyard, believe it or not, she is the first British actress that we're talking about with Best Actress. First British actress nominated for an Oscar.
What a start.
Yes. But she was a stage actress, of course, like we said, back in London and in Broadway. She made connections with the Barrymore family, and eventually she just decided to try to make it in Hollywood. So her first film was a year before this in Rasputin and the Empress, which she had previously done on stage, but then Cavalcade here was only her second film. So the film, it takes place over the course of 30 years, and it tells the story of this wealthy couple, Jane and Robert. They also have kids, then they have servants who have their own storylines. Robert goes off to war and comes back a hero, and both of their sons have these tragic circumstances happen to them, and it's all about them just sort of, I guess, trying to adjust to all the twists and turns of life at the turn of the new century, I guess is how I would sum up Cavalcade. But Diana here is playing Jane. She is mostly scene at home, just sort of worrying about her husband, worrying about her sons, worrying about the social structures of the country, and that's pretty much it. Claudio, I mean, to be honest, I understand intellectually why she was nominated. She's in the Best Picture winner, but this performance, it does almost nothing for me. What about you?
Oh boy. I really detest this performance.
Wow,
And
detest.
I'm trying not to be mean. I'm doing a concerted effort to be
Okay.
nice. I even watched other of her films so I could see her in something that I liked, and I did. I think she's splendid in the original Gaslight, the 1940 British film that precedes Ingrid Bergman's Oscar-winning role. But she's just terrible here. Like you said, intellectually, I can understand why she was nominated, and not just on the account that this is a Best Picture winner. The play Cavalcade was a huge deal in the early 30s. It was famously monumental with hundreds of extras, so much so that Noel Coward had to talk to the people he was working with by numbers and callers because memorizing all the names was impossible. And I can completely understand why they made a film out of this, because again, it got a lot of press, and because it was so technically grandiose, it wasn't possible to restage it in America, nor to do a revival in London. So I can understand, this epic work of theater that people are talking about, and the only way someone can see it after its original run was through this film. So I can understand why. And again, Diana Wynyard was like Hepburn, she was just arriving into movies, and I think there was a concerted effort by the studio to sort of promote her. She also, her role in Rasputin and the Empress also caused some hubbub, and it had to be cut down considerably. I don't know if you know this. It's the reason why we have those words saying that the story in this film is not based on real events, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Because there was a rape plotline, very pre-code Hollywood, but the real people were still alive and they sued the studio. So talk about abrupt changes. If you ever see that film, her character changes completely from one scene to the other. And again, it's not really her fault, but what she does in Cavalcade is her fault.
Yeah. So for me, naturally, as someone who has watched all the Best Picture winners, I had seen Cavalcade. I did not like Cavalcade, so I wasn't really looking forward to watching this again, even with this new lens of just focusing on Diana Wynyard. But honestly, I barely remembered anything she did in the film. So, in some respect, this sort of just felt like watching her for the first time, sort of. But I really wish there was something there for me to latch onto. But she doesn't give me anything really. A lot of what she's doing is having to look sad and worried, and I just feel like the film doesn't even really allow her to explore much outside of that emotion. So it all feels very one note. I do think that she does get better over time. I think towards the end is when she gets to have more variation in what she can do, but that's sort of more of a script thing than with her. But after about like the fifth scene of her looking morose and so many of her lines being delivered to the cheap seats, like the scene of her like bidding farewell to Robert when he's going
Oh,
off to war
I
is
want to
just,
talk about that scene.
yeah, okay. Well, so over the top, and the whole like, oh, Robert, like I get that this is a woman who's having to deal with a lot of loss and she's grieving and upset for most of the film, but I just don't understand why every single line has to be delivered with that sense that like she's crying while speaking.
It is truly bizarre. All of her lines are, well, first of all, they're not really said, they are declared there's an upward tilt to her voice in every single line reading. That, as you say, it makes it seem like she's containing a sob that never comes.
Yeah.
And that would be fine for a couple of scenes, but this is a nearly 2 hour movie. Cavalcade already feels like it lasts 33 years, even without her help. But she put in the effort to make it feel like it lasts 50.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a very old-fashioned type of performance style that I have mentioned before with someone like Ruth Chatterton that kind of grates on me at the end of the day. It really doesn't work. I'm not on the same wavelength of this performance. I mean, here's the thing. I can appreciate a performance where it feels like here's this woman who is on the brink, who's always sort of on edge and is in tears for a lot of the film. I'm thinking of like Brenda Blethyn in Secrets and Lies, or like Imelda Staunton and Vera Drake. I mean, this kind of character can still be performed well, but in those cases, I think they were able to really communicate the true heartbreak and the emotion that they were feeling. Whereas with Diana Wynyard, like, yes, she's crying and she's upset in theory, but her face just doesn't show me that she's really feeling those emotions. It just feels like a performance that's sort of on the stage, and it just doesn't really work for film, because a lot of times she's also like looking out to a non-existent audience.
Oh, constantly.
Yeah.
And to
Which
be
feels
fair,
like a choice.
well, and she's really screwed over by the direction, because you're adapting this massive stage play that is famous for having hundreds of people on stage, and you shoot it all in medium shots and close-ups.
Right.
Why? So there is our acting is mostly done through posing,
Yeah.
which can be stylistically interesting, but it must be shot in a way that enhances the experience of the audience. Most of her body is obscured during the film through just the shot composition. So the sense of artifice comes off as inorganic and more accidental almost, even if it's clearly a deliberate choice from the actress. It just feels like it's in constant friction with the very horrible filmic language of Cavalcade.
Mm-hmm.
And that scene that you mentioned, where when she's saying farewell to her husband as he goes off to war, I was just agog. Like, I had watched Cavalcade before because I've also watched all the Best Picture winners. I don't think this is the worst, by the way, even if
Okay.
some people might say so.
I don't
But
either, but it's towards the bottom.
oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Again, it's impressive. This seems like it was shot with rear projection, so again, you get a complete disconnection between the crowd surrounding them and the main players, which seems to go against the purpose of the play, which is using this family as a synecdoche for the entire British nation. So that's already a point against it. But she plays it. It's not really to the back seat. It's to a middle point, slightly to the left of the camera, to which she says most of her lines, rather than at least 50% of them.
Yeah.
And what I found interesting was that in the middle of her speech, her husband leaves. Textually, there's an indication that he leaves because, he doesn't want to live through this tearful goodbye. He's also in pain, whatever.
Yeah.
And then she realizes he's left, and she runs through the crowd, waving him goodbye. And I found it preposterous that there is no indication in Diane Wynyard's performance of the instant when she realizes her husband has left. She goes smoothly from saying the pseudo soliloquy to moving through the crowd. It looks like a rehearsed movement that wasn't worked on enough to feel organic within the context of the scene. It feels like something either you'd see on a first week of rehearsals when people are still getting into the character and the rehearsal quality is still very much felt, or like someone is bored with the material after playing the same role for 2 years.
Yeah.
And they're just in autopilot, playing the motions rather than the emotions, almost.
It's a true going through the motions kind of performance through and through. And it does feel very rehearsed and almost like, for me, it doesn't even really feel like she is the right person for this role to begin with. And that there's just a mismatch with the material and who she is as an actress. Because I really do think that maybe I think this kind of a character could be played with more dynamism, but that's not her at all. So if I were to be positive about a part of her performance, I'll say that I think it's after World War One breaks out. There's more of a weariness to her where she does at least communicate how tired she is. That it's like, here we go. The country's gone to war again, and her family's probably going to get involved in it. So it's like she's sort of preparing for another several years of heartbreak and worry. And I remember she just goes to like sit down on this chair, and she's almost like she's almost numb. But then even within that scene, she just sort of gives into the same sort of histrionics as before. She's like telling her son to drink as the Germans do, and just, flying out of the room. And it's like, there's just, I don't know.
Following your example and trying to find something positive to say about her, I do like the scene where she visits the house of her servants, and there is such a clash of class, and it's a hint of something that can sort of be read throughout the first scenes, that this is a woman who lives in this sphere of privilege, in this bubble where she doesn't really almost recognize the humanity on the people that are under her. And Diane Wynyard is taller, much taller than Una O'Connor.
Yeah,
who is reprising her stage role here, and I think is the best part of the film.
Agreed. Yes.
And so, just the pose of Diana Wynyard with her back straight in this perfect line that seems out of an Edwardian fashion plate, but then her head very pointedly looking down at Una O'Connor just reflects this class dynamic in a perfect visual way. And it's there, you get it. It's one of the only images in the film that functions and doesn't make me either laugh or roll my eyes, because that Titanic reveal, oh dear.
I love it. I love it. Ironically, but I love it. Such a reveal. But yeah.
And again, this is a bit of, because I work in costume design and I study costume design, so I'm a bit of a nerd in that regard. I like the way she embodied the costumes, because even at this time, it's not guaranteed that the actresses would be used to wearing long skirts and petticoats that were trending during the earlier decades of the century. And she does look like someone that lives in those clothes, that is used to them. She doesn't pull her skirt very often. She doesn't pick at her clothes. She doesn't feel like she's stumbling through the layers. And it's just a tiny detail, but I appreciated that.
Yeah. I think in that respect, she does at least have that sort of sense of nobility, sort of like verging on the immense privilege that she exhibits, even with these people who used to be her servants, but she's still sort of treating as second class. At least there's some aspect there that she taps into, but a lot of it goes unexplored, because also the film is very scattered and it's not always about her, and she is fully not even in multiple sequences throughout the middle of the film. So that's another thing that's a very disconnecting thing for her performance. I mean, there is a scene that I also wanted to highlight where it's another like goodbye scene. The scene where she is saying goodbye to Joey, and she sort of slowly takes out a cigarette, and she's just really exhausted by this point, and she's quite a bit older, so there's certainly more of like the old age makeup situation happening, which helps. But I think at this point you really see someone who is bitter. You see the frustration, and you see that this is a woman who is so frustrated by the state of the country that she's almost like a shell of herself, which even you see again later when she finds out what happened to Joey and she's out in the street and her emotions are really fluctuating in this ridiculous way. That's a scene that at least clicked into place for me as here's something that's effective from her performance.
I think there is something to be said about audience identification in regards to Cavalcade and Wynyard's performance in particular. I think part of the film's success stems from that, from it coming at a time when English-speaking nations were very afraid of the winds of war that were starting to come from Germany, very faintly. And the film is a bit of a reactionary object. It is very nostalgic. It's despite it trying to include other classes, it's mostly told through the perspective of the upper classes, looking aghast at a changing world. And even the Conservative Party at the time said that the film might have helped them win the election, which is horrible. And to me, is a point against the film. But there is a powerful identification going on between this collection of historical postcards and the contemporary moment where where it was released. And to me, and I don't want to sound bitchy, but there was some identification with Wynyard's character as she gets progressively more tired and frustrated. And I felt, oh, she's feeling the same as I am watching Cavalcade.
Right.
And I know it's completely unintentional, but it was a patina of humor I could find there that helped it go down easier than it might have otherwise.
It's interesting because this is a film that sort of does feel like it's trying to make a commentary about like how this new century is sort of doing away with the traditional older values sort of thing. And you see like the whole sequence towards the end with like vice orgies and how the 21st century jazz age is all about these newer values, these really quick shots of like two women who are flirting, and then there's another one where a man is giving another man a bracelet, so it's like, oh boy, here come the gays. So I don't know, I feel like, you know, the way that's framed, it's like, oh, that's interesting, that's nice, but then it's sort of framed like with the woman singing the song about how, oh God, the 21st century, boy, I don't know. So it's a weirdly messaged film that I don't really agree with. I do think the ending itself is pretty effective enough with her sort of toasting or whatever and sort of breaking the fourth wall again. But otherwise, the film is just a total bore. I mean, it's trying to like get to some levels of being profound, but I don't think it ever really gets there because also most of these performances are pretty limited to begin with. The story just whips by and it never really settles comfortably into any one time period. Like, I don't know. I feel like you barely get to know any of the characters. So not a film I recommend. And it's honestly not even one of these cases where I've talked about like, hey, at least the lead actress is here and helping to sort of prop up a film that's not so great. Like, not the case here.
No, yeah. I wish I could be nicer to the film. I try to be an advocate for being generous as a spectator, but I can't. I can't. This was only the second time I ever watched Cavalcade, by the way. I have the DVD. It was never rewatched.
It was collecting dust on your shelf.
until now.
Right.
Oh, what joy. What joy.
You're welcome.
This
was a quote from the New York Times, who disagrees with us. They said, Miss Wynyard is excellent as Jane Marriott. She portrays her role with such sympathy and feeling that one scarcely thinks of her as an actress.
Well, because she's more of an idea than a person.
Well, there you have it. I do think in her case, it really helps that she was in the film that was winning Best Picture and was the talk of the town. That's pretty much how I can explain her nomination.
And the film was also a financial success, I believe.
Yeah, even though I know it was a little bit divisive, like it wasn't a universally praised film. But yeah.
One would hope so.
Once again, even then. Any other thoughts? Probably not. Do you have anything else to get off your chest about Diana Wynyard or Cavalcade?
Okay, I would say that her performance would work much better in a film that was shot very differently, without changing anything about the performance. If you put it in another context, I might like it much more.
Yeah. I think this is a performance that might work better if it was played by someone else.
Okay.
So that's where I'm at. let's move on to our big winner here. Here we go. Katharine Hepburn for Morning Glory. So, yeah, here we are. The first nominated performance of Katharine Hepburn, the first winning performance of Katharine Hepburn. As of now, as many people know, she is still the only actress to have won this category 4 times. She has 12 nominations in her career, all in Best Actress. And like with the actresses we've already talked about, she made a name for herself on the stage, even though it was a little rocky on the stage those early years for her. But she went to Hollywood and she knew her worth. She demanded a good salary for her first film, and she got it. She got very good reviews, and then Morning Glory ended up being only her third film, and another really strong showcase for her particular brand and sort of style of acting. She is playing an aspiring stage actress named Eva Lovelace. She's very spunky and ready to do whatever it takes to get on the stage, and so she basically finds herself in the right rooms with the right people. At one point, she performs a scene out of Hamlet and then does one from Romeo and Juliet, and that ends up really impressing the producers. And eventually, by the end of the film, she gets a great opportunity to perform sort of in place of another actress, and she proves herself. And there's also romance, a love triangle involved. And yeah, this is a big deal because this is the first time we'll be talking about this legend of the screen. So I'm curious, Claudio, first off, what are your thoughts on Katharine Hepburn as a screen presence?
I love Katharine Hepburn. I'm a really big fan. That being said, she wasn't always perfect, and this period in her career finds her trying a lot of things that simply didn't work for her, despite very visible and strenuous effort.
Wow.
I love her, though. Hello, I'm a fan.
Yeah, I also love Katharine Hepburn. I mean, she's a fascinating person on top of being just this really great actress. I get why she has some detractors, because if you don't like her style, it's not like she's like a Daniel Day-Lewis type of actor who transforms for every part. You know, she always has a little bit of herself in a lot of the roles she plays, but it works for me, you know. I think she can be very charming, and I do think she's good here. I think the nature of the script lets her down in some regard. She has to be kind of grating and a little too plucky. I think she certainly has better performances later on, and she also has a better performance in this eligibility window, which is Little Women. But this is a performance that it does work for me. I'm always sort of charmed by her in most of her films. I think she shows a lot of that sort of eagerness at the beginning, just from like when she's looking at all the photos of the actors on the wall. I love the quietness of that scene, and she really is communicating like the wonder and of being in New York and your first big arrival there. And I think the same is also true when she's just really talking people's ear off in the office about all of her hopes and dreams and her background. And she has this really fun, subtle moment that I picked up on when she's talking about her hometown of Franklin, Vermont, where she kind of like screws up her face a little bit when she's talking about it. So I like that. I mean, there's certainly some arrogance there in how she's sort of proclaiming herself to be the best actress in the world, and all her big monologues tend to go on for a while. So not always the easiest character to love, but I think that's what I like about it. It's she's not afraid to be a little much sometimes.
This is not my favorite performance from Hepburn's 4 eligible movies this Oscar year. That would be Little Women. But it's interesting comparing her to May Robson, because to me, they're sort of at the same level in terms of performance. One is an actress excelling at a very simple job and a text that doesn't offer her a lot to do, while the other is an actress really going big and going for it with a text that gives her plenty to do, sometimes too much, in my opinion.
I think she does have a magnetism, though, even in those moments where she's going off on her diatribes. There's still a bit of the twinkle in her eye, a little bit of an innocence there that does make you root for her. And then, like, obviously, when she has that scene when she shows off her acting skills, I think she does prove her worth. I mean, that's an interesting scene because sometimes I wonder exactly how we as an audience are supposed to take that scene of her going into the to be or not to be monologue and then going into playing Juliet. I sort of see it just sort of earnestly in terms of her really showing what she can do. But I can also see like a version of that being like, who is this crazy woman at this party who's suddenly acting out Shakespearean scenes?
I will just say she has major Rachel Berry energy.
I can't believe you said that because I also thought that while watching it. Like, especially when she's first there and she's really going off and talking about how, like, oh, this is why I did this and this and this, and I'm gonna be the greatest, and this is why I changed my name, and like, you're gonna be my teacher, and it's gonna be great.
I do love when she's describing how she's going to die on stage at the
Yes,
top of her talents, at the top of her game. She
that
will
does have Rachel Berry energy.
she will die. She will decide when to expire at her brightest moment. Oh, I do think she's very funny in a self-aware way. I think there is intention behind the brittle obnoxiousness of the character,
Yeah, I agree.
and she does allow the audience to perceive moments of vulnerability, like the one you mentioned when she is where you can see she doesn't really like the place where she came from, or when she's leaving a place and she some of her last words are thank you, and it's a very subtle moment in what is a very loud performance. It's almost as if the character herself is swallowing down something else she might want to say, or an inflection she might want to have, and she is very much at 11 the entire time.
Yeah.
And she's not helped not by the director or the script. It's interesting to compare Morning Glory to its remake Stage Struck, which is not a perfect film by any means, but there is a much bigger variety of tones that Sidney Lumet is able to pull from the material. I love her drunk scene. Katharine Hepburn was a master at playing drunk, as
Yeah.
anyone who's seen the Philadelphia Story will attest to. And it's great. And I do like that her Hamlet is markedly worse than her Juliet.
It is.
And that she's able to pinpoint those differences, even if her Juliet is still being performed through an haze of alcohol and this very stilted pose she configures her body into.
Yeah.
I think she's more proficient at delineating those levels of quality in her work as an actress within the narrative than, for example, in Stage Door, which, in my opinion, is a much better film than Morning Glory. But in that one, I have more doubts in terms of like when the character is supposed to be doing great. I'm not really seeing it. But here, I think there is a very stark but not too obvious differentiation between when she's grasping at something that's beyond her range and when she's doing something that's really impressive. That being said, I think Hepburn is really betrayed by the film, by that ending.
Yeah.
As much as I love her, she's not able to solve that. And she has I don't want to say curse, but it's really harmful to how one remembers her performance that I think she ends in her worst scene, in her worst moment.
More artificial. Yeah.
It reminded me in some ways of my issues with My Fair Lady and the filmed version of Pygmalion, which altered the ending. And as much as I appreciate a lot of elements that come before, the ending is so disruptive, so out of place that just doesn't work. And it's fascinating to see such a career-oriented person as Katharine Hepburn ended up revealing herself to be, playing someone who gives up her career for love, and is seen as this noble act that she will be content with her morning glory.
Yeah, I did want to talk about this ending where she's asked to do a lot more dramatic stuff of really questioning whether she really wants this and what to do about Joseph and her sort of romantic life. I think she at least shows her doubt pretty well there. I mean, as a performer, I think she's better when she's commanding a room and she's confident and, maybe a little narcissistic, but sort of earns that feeling. Feels the most truthful to her as an artist. So those later moments really don't connect with me as much. I think in general, it's good work, especially for this being her third performance on film, and the thing is, though, that she would go on to much better performances. So it's interesting that this is one of her Oscar wins. We will get into that in a little bit, but I agree that by the end of the film, it just feels like a little bit more unsatisfying than I am hoping the ending would be in the beginning of the film. Because I think for the first third to like the first half, she's really in command and she knows what she's doing. By the end, it's the story itself is not as interesting as I hope that it is every time I watch it.
I would say that, especially at this point in her career, Katharine Hepburn wasn't the best at playing earnestness, and the ending is very earnest. Through most of the film, she is acting through a layer of over-eager posturing and someone who's pretending to be more confident than they really are, and that really helps her find slight variations even within this very continuous tonal line. I was watching the film and sort of thinking of other Hepburn films I love, other Hepburn performances I love, and I was thinking, for example, of Long Day's Journey into Night or Lion in the Winter, where some of my favorite moments are when the character is deviating, is showing true emotion through a very calculated jab or a naked lie. She's really good at exposing the person that is beneath a veneer of artifice, even if it's just in a social context. And when she's asked to be very nakedly vulnerable, especially if it's in a very exuberant register, I think she tends to come off as insincere sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think she does sort of almost fall back on a more traditional acting style that she might have seen from other actresses rather than really explore those emotions to the full extent of her abilities.
I'm reminded at this paradigm of her career in this early period. But to me, one of her best efforts is at Alice Adams, where she's playing through a lie, and the way she shows earnestness and vulnerability is by showing the cracks in a facade that is falling apart in real time. It's a pity that, to me, are better performances in this vein of sort of unilateral earnestness weren't recognized by the Academy. For example, I think Holiday is a very atypical work for her in this phase of her career. Watching her films chronologically, it really shows a progression of an actress that's finding new ways to express herself in front of the camera. There is a marked growth. I think in Morning Glory, despite very good moments, that drunk Shakespeare scene, again, is amazing. She still very much sounds and moves and looks like a novice film actor that is still getting used to their own presence in a film plateau.
She's trying to find the confidence in her own skin a little more on screen. So yeah, that does make sense. It's fun also reading about her first arrival in Hollywood and how her entire presentation and her sensibilities just left so many producers like gobsmacked by how to even deal with a woman like this. Like, she wore slacks and she wanted to do her own hair and makeup and she wanted her own salary that was proper, and she didn't really want to do interviews. She didn't attend the Oscars, obviously. It was really all about the work for her. She didn't want any of the ancillary stuff. And I think in a way that almost did focus her on her craft and is why she got better over time rather than buying into her own hype a little too much or resting on her laurels. I think what drove her was really just trying to get better and better. But she was such a unique presence that really just fascinated so many people that I think Hollywood just had no choice but to keep giving her these great roles because she was pretty much always up to the task. It is interesting also reading this review from Variety, which said, Morning Glory isn't an entirely happy choice for Katharine Hepburn, but the star provides a strong performance. So once again, we have a situation where it feels like the reviews are centered on, hey, this actress was very good, even if the film is not great. But we can sort of transition into other elements of why we think Katharine Hepburn won this Oscar. When I look at this performance and then I look at the other two performances nominated, it doesn't really surprise me at all that she won this. I mean, she was the ingenue and she represents the kind of it girl of the moment in a way, the one who had a strong future ahead of her. She gets to really show her range in the film, and honestly, like throughout the film in this case, that you compare that to May Robson and Diana Wynyard, and they are like missing for sections of their own films. You compare that to what Katharine Hepburn is doing. She has a very clear Oscar scene, quote unquote, with the Shakespeare drunk moment. All of those things, I think, add up to a pretty clear reason why she won. Do you have anything to add on that?
The only thing I might add is that it really feels like 1932, 1933 was like our arrival in Hollywood was momentous. The way the studio pushed her into big roles almost instantly, the way RKO promoted her, this atypical starlet. Even this is her third film, and this film is completely built around her. It's a star vehicle for someone that didn't really, at this point, proven herself to be a star. And there's something to be said about the power of the promotional machine. And comparing to the other two roles, as you said, it's incredibly central. It's incredibly showy. She doesn't disappear for large portions of Morning Glory. And I think, well, the mediocrity of the film around her makes her shine brighter. Like, I feel as if the film was better, or, relative faults or limitations would be less excusable, but because she's really the only thing that makes this film worth watching. In Little Women, for example, which I think she's better in, but there's so much more in that film that I can imagine someone watching that film and coming out of it not talking about her. While I think it's impossible for someone to watch Morning Glory and have any opinion that's not centered primarily around Hepburn.
No, that's very true. The discussion begins and ends with Katharine Hepburn when it comes to this film. Even some of the other actors I don't think are really worthy of discussion that much. We didn't even talk about them because they don't really factor in. But I will say, I did read that it was a close vote, apparently, between her and May Robson. And there also wasn't a lot of applause when she won. Obviously, she didn't attend, which might have been part of it. But I was reading that Frances Marion had written later on that only those who had worked with her could testify to her friendliness. To others, she seemed high hat. So I think in this case, yes, it makes sense that she won, but it also makes sense that she would still have her detractors at this stage for people who didn't really know her very well yet at this point. This feeling of like, oh, she thinks she's too good for us. I'm going to put my vote onto this woman who's been in the business for years and years and years. In the case of May Robson, that probably accounts for the close vote, I would guess.
Yes, and throughout the 30s, up until the point where she was considered box office poison in 1938, when reading how the press would write about her after the sort of big coming out moment with 4 films in the space of 14 months, there is a reluctance to accept her as a star, both for angular features, for this sense of educated superiority, the New England accent that speaks of a patrician upbringing, which was not perhaps the best thing for someone trying to become a star during the Great Depression.
Right. And just her sense of like her taking on some more like masculine sensibilities, I think was a bit like off kilter for some people. So I think we should get to questions from Twitter before we talk about why we think May Robson was the runner-up. This is from Christoph N., who said, apparently Frank Capra originally sought to cast Marie Dressler as Apple Annie in Lady for a Day. Can you see her in the part, and do you think she could have gotten her third consecutive nomination if she had gotten the part?
I would say yes to both.
Wow.
Marie Dressler's very very temporary stardom is such a brilliant and fascinating artifact of pre-code cinema. The way she became a superstar, and maybe I'm being biased because I love her in everything I've seen her in. So yeah, I think she'd succeed. And considering she'd gotten in for something like Emma, I think she would have gotten in for a film that was this beloved as Lady for a Day.
Yeah, I could very much obviously see her in this role. It feels like, again, like I was saying earlier, this is exactly the kind of role that feels like it's almost written for her. But honestly, I'm not as sure if she would have gotten a third in a row, especially because there is some similarity in the kind of role it is from what they've already nominated from her. I talked about last week how there was a little bit of discussion within the Academy about, like, do we want to keep rewarding the same people? Do we want to give repeat wins? Do we want to continue to, nominate the same people? So I wonder if there was a faction that maybe felt like, okay, we've done the Marie Dressler thing. Let's do some others, especially in a field of 3. Maybe if it was a field of 5, I think she could have gotten in, but maybe none of this matters, and she was such a big star anyway that she just would have muscled her way in like she always does. So there you go. This is from John T. If Robson had won this, would Hepburn have had to wait until 1967 to get her first trophy, or what performance would have gotten her the statue before then?
Considering how downward her public image and popularity with moviegoers went in the ensuing years of the 1930s, I don't think she would have gotten an Oscar during this decade, even for something as good and well-reviewed as Alice Adams, especially considering Betty Davis's momentum after a write-in vote. But I think she might have won for The Philadelphia Story if she hadn't had an Oscar already, because that was such a momentous comeback. The Academy clearly loved the film, even giving it a Best Actor award that, in retrospective, seems weird considering some of the opponents, even though I like that victory.
Yeah, I don't think she would have had to wait until quite that long, 1967. I think she could have gotten it for Alice Adams. I think definitely The Philadelphia Story is a very good possibility, especially because that was the year that Ginger Rogers won, and that was her only time nominated and winning. So I think maybe Katharine Hepburn might have had a little bit of an edge there, possibly. But even some of the ones in the 50s, it could have happened there if there was a building narrative.
Like,
so,
yeah, The African Queen would be a good example, too.
That would have been wild, because that would be over Vivian Leigh.
Well, Bogart won over Brando.
That's true.
And if she if she was like Bogart, overdue at that point, I think she might have won. Yeah.
Let's move on to Luke Valet, who said, so for Kate, why Morning Glory when Little Women was right there?
Well, I think I've answered this question.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Pretty much. I'll just say it's a very good question, especially because Little Women is a Best Picture nominee. It also gets into a field of 3 for Best Director. So clearly the more popular film. Morning Glory was not, but this sort of ties into the next question, so I'll sort of answer them both in this case. From Gabe Guarin saying, apparently RKO Pictures pushed Hepburn for Morning Glory instead of Little Women because they wanted to salvage the flop of Morning Glory. What was the mentality behind that decision? So I hadn't really heard that before myself. I mean, I do think that's the kind of thing that can happen with studios who want to say that they at least got some good out of a project that ended up being more of a flop. Possibly, though, they thought that her sort of Shakespearean monologues and the fact that she's playing an actor would be baitier to the Academy than Little Women. I can also imagine a thought process where they thought this would also be a role that would appeal more to the men of the Academy than Little Women, even though Little Women obviously did very well anyway.
Well, I think that having Morning Glory branded as an Oscar-winning film would help if they ever wanted to re-release it to get some profit out of it in
Right.
a way that maybe wouldn't have so markedly helped Little Women.
Right. And like you also said, it's Morning Glory is such the discussion really does end there, that it's the Katharine Hepburn story, that sometimes that kind of a thing is able to supplant a film where, you know, the film and a lot of the parts around it are really good, and that can sometimes take away from a performance discussion. So this is from Alicio Martinez. If you could cast a modern remake of Morning Glory, who would you cast in the principal roles?
I must confess that I read the Twitter questions beforehand and thought way too much about this particular question.
Oh, good. Okay, me too. So, did you have any you wanted to say right away? I'm sure you've written them down.
Sure. I have the complete main cast already, and an idea for restructuring of the themes in the text. Can I say my cast?
Yeah.
Should I announce it? Okay, so for Eva, the Hepburn role, I like the idea of Ailey Lou Richardson.
Oh, wow. I love her.
I think this is a very abrasive role, but it can benefit especially in the latter sequences from someone that can play very big, very earnest emotions and still make it seem believable. And after watching Support the Girls, I would trust Ailey Lou Richardson with my life in that regard.
There you go. Yep. I love that.
And she also has this peppy, overeager energy that can be easily downplayed into a more meditative, self-reflective approach, like in Columbus. She's got the range.
She does. I love that choice.
For the writer, I would choose William Jackson Harper.
Love him too.
Because
I'm loving this already.
Because sincerely, I've just watched the Underground Railroad, and so he's in my mind. I just like him in this idea of this playwright who is translating a German text into English and becoming suddenly interested in this girl because she somehow also knows the text. And I don't know, I think they might have a frictious energy about them that would help me like some of the later developments in the plot more than with Hepburn and Fairbanks Jr., who is handsome but could be played by a lamp.
Right.
For her mentor, I would gender flip the role, and I thought of Angela Bassett.
Perfect.
Because I was thinking of actors, contemporary actors that have this powerful declamatory style of speaking, and I just love how she speaks. I would just love to see her do Shakespeare. She should have been Lady Macbeth to Denzel Washington's Macbeth. I'm sorry.
Oh my God. Wow. Yes.
And I would love even the different dynamic that would happen between two women in those roles, and also the questions of racial privilege that could come up, even if not, directly spoken in the text, that could erupt from this African American mentor character who sometimes looks down, sometimes is half amused and charmed by this overeager white girl. I think that could be interesting, especially if this text would be more willing to criticize some of Lovelace's impulses. I think an adaptation of this text would be more willing to openly criticize or explore the entitlement that she expresses at times. Could be interesting.
Yeah.
It could be a fascinating way to update it to 21st century and to the current acting business. Because I love Velvet Goldmine and I want to see Eddie Izzard play more impresarios, I would cast him in the role of the manager, and I think they would be a hoot. I was thinking of Izzard playing the scene where the manager is trying to to convince a star to take on a role through reverse psychology. And I just pictured it in my head, what this art would do. And I fell in love with that idea. And finally, for the established star that you see at the beginning of the film and whose role Eva Lovelace eventually gets, I would cast Jessica Chastain because I want her to play another campy supporting role.
That's a really good choice, yeah.
Because I think she's really good at it and at playing with levels of humor and stylization, like in The Help and even in something like Crimson Peak. I think she's really good at actressing at the sidelines of a film.
Right.
And though I like to see her as a star, watching her almost eviscerates the idea of a successful actress in this context could be thrilling and could be an opportunity for her to have fun with the role, which I think would be a good way to subvert the potentially misogynistic readings of this character. I thought way too much about this. I'm sorry.
That was very good. I feel like mine will pale in comparison, but didn't quite think about it too much. But I think there's a few easy ones that, you know, they would go to for the Katharine Hepburn role, like Emma Stone, obviously seems like she could do something like that. Jennifer Lawrence, Saoirse Ronan. But I did go for a different kind of angle, which is Ruth Negga.
Oh.
I'd like to see her dabble a little bit in a character with a lot of personality. And I know that she could definitely handle the drama very well. She has a very expressive face, and I think she does have a lot of range, and I think that would be a fun twist as well. So as far as other roles, like for the Adolphe Menjou role, I mean, like a Stanley Tucci seems good for that kind of thing, you know, or any of those roles, to be honest. He always feels like he should be like a manager of something. For the Douglas Fairbanks Jr., give me like a Daniel Kaluuya. I can also see for the role of the actress that she is replacing, something like Sarah Paulson. I think she can play into the diva aspect pretty well, I would imagine. So those are the ones that I quickly wrote down.
Oh, I'd love to see that cast too, especially Paulson.
Yeah, I love when she gets to have fun. Well, let's finish out these questions. This is from Owen Daly. Which of her co-nominees' roles do you think Hepburn could have believably played when she was of the right age to play them during her lengthy career? So I don't think either of them particularly suit her, to be honest. But between the two, I guess the Diana Wynyard role, just because I look at the end of Cavalcade and it sort of gives me those kind of On Golden Pond vibes, like, oh, look at everything we've been through. You know, I think in terms of like also holding back tears, it's sort of like what she did in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. So like, if I had to choose, that one would make more sense to me. What do you think?
I wholeheartedly agree. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of those more sentimental star turns by Hepburn.
Right.
The only thing that sort of stops me from saying the Diane Wynyard role is that Katharine Hepburn is notoriously bad at accents.
That's true. Fair point.
Does anyone remember her Mary Queen of Scots? Because I do.
Well, we're going to have to move the entire film to America.
Or just
to accommodate this.
Or just ignore it. Or Eleanor of Aquitaine spoke as if she were from New England, and it worked.
Fair enough.
Hepburn sort of played the same type as May Robson, sort of, in The Mad Woman of Shiloh. And that's not one of her best performances, which makes me go more toward the Diane Wynyard role.
Well, this is from Mark Lamb. Does Diane Wynyard have an Oscar scene? How about Katharine Hepburn? I mean, Katharine certainly has her Shakespeare moment, which, again, is a very clear Oscar scene. Diana, I guess, has a handful. Like I mentioned, the scene where she's bidding farewell to Joey towards the end. I mean, I don't know. I guess.
Well, the Oscar likes monologues, and she has a lot of them.
Exactly. Whether they're effective as Oscar scenes is up for debate. This is from Mark Lamb. We have another thought experiment here. Suppose they are remaking Cavalcade, but instead of being an epic about 1900 to 1933, it will be 1990 to 2021. Who would play the Diana Wynyard character to a possible Oscar nomination? And then I saw another reply under that that's asking us to like speculate what the events would have been in like the plot of the film. So, I mean, we could do that too. I don't want to be here for too long.
Well,
I mean,
the ending.
this is an upper class British couple. I'm sure we'd tackle Brexit. You know.
Well, and the ending would
maybe
be a downer. Brexit followed by the pandemic.
right. I guess we're ending on the coronavirus. You know, maybe we get in a Princess Diana's death.
Yeah, instead of the Queen Victoria death.
Exactly. So it could work.
Could work.
Yeah. But for who would play the Diana Wynyard character, I mean, if the question is who would rather than who should, I think there's a lot of different options. I think like even like going back to Emma Thompson, I think like even if she wouldn't be something she'd be interested in per se, she'd probably be offered that. Olivia Colman, probably same deal. For some reason, I thought of Emily Watson, I think, could perform this kind of a role well.
Yeah,
What do you think?
my only doubt is that I think, not to be offensive, but they're a bit too old for the role because she has to age 33 years in the film.
That's true.
And
well, there's new de-aging technology.
and, well, I didn't consider that. And that worked so well before.
Of course.
But so I was thinking of someone that could believably play the mother of very young children at the beginning and age it up by 3 decades. And curiously enough, I thought of Ruth Negga.
Oh, well, there you go.
It was interesting that you mentioned her before because I thought I'd really like to see her do that because she's really good at listening and portraying grief, but also adding some levity and variety to her performances.
You know what? I think she could play all 3 of these roles.
Yeah,
I really do.
I also thought of Andrea Riseborough just because she's very.
Oh yeah, she's a chameleon.
Yeah, she's very able to change her physicality and even her facial expressions. I think she would, at least the physical part of the role, and having to act through increasing layers of makeup would be something she'd be right for. And my other possibility was Rebecca Hall, just because I think she would add an astringency to the role. I don't think she's an actress that is that tends towards sentimentality. She very much goes the opposite route in most of her roles, even something that could really go into melodrama, like that World War One miniseries she did with Benedict Cumberbatch, Parade's End. She could very easily have played it like such melodrama, but she's very good at adding an anti-sentimentalism to her roles, and I think she'd have been an interesting addition to a narrative that is mostly characterized by nostalgia and yearning for simpler times.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But knowing Hollywood, they would just cast Margot Robbie.
Well, obviously.
So, truly, like, what's even the point of discussing it? You know what? How about Mandy Moore? She does 2 different ages on This Is Us. She could do this.
Sure.
She could be an old person.
She can be a British woman.
Exactly. There you go. Anyway, let's get to a few questions about snubs. Andrew Carden said, should Mae West have made the cut for She Done Him Wrong? And do you think she was in serious contention for a nomination? I would have loved that. I don't know if Mae West had the most range necessarily, but I always advocate for comedy getting a little more recognition than it does, so I would have loved it. I'm sure she got some votes just because the film got into Best Picture, but...
I would love that. I wouldn't nominate her, but I would love for Mae West to be a Best Actress nominee. Like you, I think the Oscars should value comedy more, even if they did that more regularly in the 1930s. I'm not sure if she was in serious consideration. It's interesting to note how sort of anti-sex symbol and anti-glamour girl the Oscars
Yeah.
were at this time, especially in regards to the actresses they tended to nominate, was always people that had a public persona of seriousness, or at least of being very much about the craft of acting.
Yeah.
And I don't
So,
I don't think Mae West really fits that model.
no, she doesn't. Again, I mean, the fact that it got into Best Picture is the only thing that's making me think that there must have been a little bit of support, but probably not to get into even a top five.
Sometimes
Um,
there are outliers like Marlene Dietrich's nomination for Morocco, but
this is from Gabe Garin. Did any of the women from 42nd Street or Gold Diggers of Broadway deserve a nod? I assume he's referring to Gold Diggers of 1933 in this case, but yes, I think Ruby Keeler in either of those films would have been a great nominee. Same for Ginger Rogers. It would have been nice if Ginger Rogers got a nomination for any of her musicals.
just for the way she handles that monocle.
Exactly.
Uh,
Ginger and her monocle. Iconic.
Actually, I would say out of those two films, the actress I would more readily nominate is Joan Blondell in Gold Diggers of 1933.
I'm fine with that too. Yeah. Well, this is from Chels, who said, how would you fill out the last two slots to make it a clean five?
Okay, so again, I read these questions before, so I
Yep,
overthought this incredibly.
of course. Yes,
Uh,
good.
so I watched around 40 eligible films out of this Oscar year, sort of to get an idea of the possibilities.
Wow.
I kind of there is what the Oscars would probably have done if they had five slots, and what I would have done. Uh,
Yeah, there's always that division.
because I think the Oscars would probably have nominated Ellen Hayes for A Farewell to Arms. It's almost surprising
Yep.
she's not there. And because again they were so obsessed with theater actresses making their screen debut, I think maybe Ethel Barrymore might have got in for Rasputin and
Yeah.
the Empress, which did get a screenplay nomination.
Mm-hmm.
If not her, maybe Norma Shearer for Smiling Through and their double role. Now, for what I would do, I would probably nominate Marlene Dietrich for Blonde Venus. She is my winner from that year.
Good.
And Marion Davis for Blondie of the Follies,
Oh,
which is
Marion.
which is a shockingly modern performance to watch in a film from the pre-code era. I love Citizen Kane, but what he did to Marion Davis's legacy is a crime.
Yeah,
She was such a great actress, and this is a very cliched sentence, but she was ahead of her time.
she was too ahead of her time for people. Yeah,
And
yeah.
if I could put off Wynyard, I would put Barbara Stanwyck for Babyface, but
Wow.
that's going too far.
That was not part of the question, but you went an extra step on that one. Well, in that case, I'm
Apologies.
gonna I'm gonna replace Katharine Hepburn for Morning Glory for Katharine Hepburn in Little Women. But I honestly do really not love, but I like Helen Hayes enough in Farewell to Arms that I would have been fine with that nomination. Again, going back to it, Mae West, just for the hilarity of her being nominated for a role like that, would have been fun. Again, Ruby Keeler, Joan Blondell, Ginger Rogers, like we said, Kay Francis for Trouble in Paradise, Miriam Hopkins for Trouble in Paradise. There's a few
Jean Harlow for about 4 or 5 films.
in her career. Yes, never got a nomination.
Yeah.
Last question from Christoph N. As both Jewel Robbery and Trouble in Paradise were eligible, Kay Francis was one of Warner Brothers' biggest, or at least best paid stars of that era, yet she was never nominated for an Oscar. Unfair slight, or who is Kay Francis and why are you asking questions about her? I love the sassiness of that question. It reminds me of another film title, who is Harry Kellerman and why is he saying those terrible things about me? So that made me laugh. But I do know who Kay Francis is, despite the sass in that tweet. But yeah, as far as like whether that was an unfair slight that she was never nominated, I would say so. I love her voice. I love the delivery she brings to the screen. And again, in Trouble in Paradise, she is really excellent, and that would have been a great nomination. So, haven't seen Jewel Robbery, though.
Oh, she is delightful in that. Actually, out of these this eligibility period, if I were to nominate her, I would nominate her for One Way Passage, which is the pinnacle of melodrama. And it's so short and so emotionally ripe. I love it, and she's brilliant in it. I do think she suffered from some of that prejudice against glamour girls.
Right.
Reading press from the time, she is very much described as a clothes horse,
Right.
and talks about her lisp, etc. She was not really considered a serious actress, which I think is unfair. Maybe I wouldn't have nominated her, but I do think that for such a popular actress, never to have been recognized by the Academy does show a certain. I think it can be characterized as a snub. That's what I would say, especially since One Way Passage won the screenplay Oscar, didn't it?
Yes, it won for Best Original Story.
Yeah. So they
over Rasputin and the Empress, for that matter.
So they clearly saw it and liked it.
Yeah. It seems like a concerted effort to not go for those glamour girls, which sucks. I mean, I think they would have probably nominated a performance like that just a few years earlier, but I think the taste was already changing with what they wanted to reward, unfortunately.
I would agree.
But let's get to our final segment where we discuss both why we think May Robson was the runner-up and who we would have voted for. So why do we think, in this case, May Robson was the runner-up instead of Diana Wynyard? Performance aside, what other elements do you think contributed to that?
Well, Frank Capra was becoming quite the Oscar favorite in the 1930s. He would become much more in the next few years. So I think there's something to that. Also, the film was a very big success in terms of popularity and commercial viability. And it's a fairy tale for the Great Depression. I think there's something to that. And she's lovable. I think it's easier to love May Robson's Apple Annie than any of the other characters in this competition. And even though I prefer when the Oscars focus on performances rather than roles, I think sometimes it plays a part.
I think that's right. I think the likability factor, I think the fact that she probably worked with so many people that were in the Academy already was another factor that does help a lot. And if you look at certain races like apples and oranges, I think May Robson represents something a little different compared to Katharine Hepburn and Diana Wynyard, who are both newer stars coming from the stage, making names for themselves. May Robson is, here she has this really great lead role. Let's rally behind her, sort of thing. I think that more, I guess, traditional vote probably went towards May Robson.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, just the uniqueness and the dynamism of Katharine Hepburn was too powerful to overcome that. So, yeah. Next question. Who would you have voted for from these three?
Okay, this is a tough question, one that I've been pondering during our entire conversation. It's very close to me between Robson and Hepburn. None of them are performances I love, though I admire certain parts of it. I love Spreading the Wealth, so that would maybe incline me more towards Robson, who never won an Oscar. But there's also the fact that I do tend to like something that is very ambitious and it partially fails, than something that is modest in intent and does a solid job. So I'd probably vote for Hepburn.
Mm-hmm. I think if I'm a person in 1933 and I'm seeing this really unique actress for the first time, I'm probably more drawn to that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But I think with the hindsight of knowing who Katharine Hepburn would become all the way through the 80s of, winning for On Golden Pond, I think I'm leaning more towards May Robson myself, because I also think she was not given the material necessarily of a Katharine Hepburn in Morning Glory, but she made the most of it in pretty much every scene she had. And I'm trying my best to think about performance isolated from writing and directing when I'm doing this series. and not trying to factor in too much of all the other elements that the actress wasn't able to control so much as just her performance almost in a vacuum. And that's why I'm leaning more towards May Robson in this case, because I also feel that Katharine Hepburn would have much greater roles later on. That's sadly another part of it that's contributing to an outside factor. But I mean, obviously Diana Wynyard's not ever even close to these two, but I think I'd go with May Robson here.
I agree with your point. I think maybe if I put myself in the shoes of a 1933 voter, I would go for Hepburn, but knowing what she would become, I would also want to give Robson the golds during this only opportunity she had.
After a long career. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And to also reward her for like being in so many films in this eligibility window too. Like she's a workhorse.
Yeah. She even starred in 2 of Wynyard's films.
Right. And she was in Dinner at 8 with Marie Dressler, So she was very well connected. So yeah, that is the episode. Thank you so much, Claudio, for joining me. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been a fan for some years, and this is a dream come true.
Wow.
No, really, and thank you for making it so fun to discuss these movies with you, even if they are not films I'm particularly drawn to.
Yes, I appreciate you for taking one for the team and watching Cavalcade again. But where can people find more of you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter at Cláudio Alves DC. I'm also on Letterboxd, and you can find my writing on The Film Experience. I also write for the Belgian website Photogenie. That's in English. And if you can read Portuguese, you can find my writing on the Portuguese website, Magazine HD.
Very good. Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the podcast is at Oscar Runner-Up on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram at AndTheRunnerUpIs. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/AndTheRunnerUpIs, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes for a small monthly fee. So this is the last main show episode for October, and in 2 weeks on November 3rd, we'll be talking about the Best Actress race of 1934. We're finally going to be getting to the point in the Oscars of just covering 1 year as opposed to 2, which makes things easier and cleaner. So the nominees there were Claudette Colbert in It Happened One Night, Grace Moore in One Night of Love, and Norma Shearer for The Barretts of Wimpole Street. And as a bonus, the Academy had a write-in nominee, Bette Davis, for Of Human Bondage. And the Oscar winner there was Claudette Colbert for It Happened One Night. Excited to talk about that film, excited to talk about the wildness of that write-in vote. So that's what to watch before the next episode. And with that, I'll bid you all adieu.